Welcome to the Season 2 of the India Energy Hour podcast. The India Energy Hour podcast explores the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities of India's energy transition through an in-depth discussion on policies, financial markets, social movements, and science. The podcast is hosted by energy transition researcher and author Dr. Sandeep Pai and senior energy and climate journalist Shreya Jay. The show is produced by multimedia journalist Tejas Dayananda Sagar.
The upcoming COP27 is expected to set the tone for developing economies to strengthen their climate-focused demands from the developed world. Adaptation solutions, loss and damage funds, and enhanced climate financing are likely to be the focus areas. Though the shadow of the Russia-Ukraine war and impending recession might impact negotiations, it is no doubt that climate-related challenges faced by the African nations will be under the spotlight. To discuss the issues and challenges faced by the developing countries and how Africa can negotiate a deal at COP27 that benefits the continent, we talked with James Irungu Mwangi, Executive Director at the Dalberg Group in Kenya. James Mwangi is a sustainable development and inclusive growth expert with a career spanning more than 2 decades in public policy, energy, and strategic planning.
Hi, James. Welcome to the India Energy Hour podcast. We're delighted to talk to you about the topic of COP27 and priorities of emerging economies and priorities of Africa at this COP. So let's get started. It is our tradition that in this podcast, we start by asking our guests about their professional and personal journey. Where are you from? What did you study? How did you get to work in climate and energy topics, and what sort of has been your journey, and what are there any specific events that shaped your professional and personal journey?
Thanks, Sandeep. It's great to be on and great to have the conversation. My journey to climate, I'll just tell you, is a bit of a circuitous one. I am what I think the technical term for me is a recent and zealous convert. I'll explain that zeal and that recency. So I'm originally from Kenya, where I grew up. I do have ties to India, though. My wife is from Chennai, and my children are half Indian. Very, very proud overseas citizens of India. So I do feel a little bit of a tie that way. Born in Kenya, though, and went to the United States for college. Was fortunate enough to get a scholarship to a U.S. university. And then began my career in management consulting or strategy consulting at McKinsey & Company in New York, where I spent 2 years that were really interrupted by the 9/11 attacks, which tells people a little bit about how old I am. Coming out of that, I felt like there needed to be perhaps a higher purpose to the work that I was doing, given the fissures and the fragility it exposed in the world. Having lived not too far from where the attacks took place, they really struck home in that way. And encountered a group of other folks who were leaving McKinsey at that time, a pair of other erstwhile colleagues who were launching a new consulting firm called Dalberg that was to focus exclusively on work to contribute to a more inclusive and sustainable world. So I joined the founding team of Dalberg in the very earliest stages, and in more of a tribute to my procrastination and failure to move, have stayed there ever since. So moved to found Dalberg's Africa business in 2007, served as managing partner of our global consulting business for a number of years after that. And then more recently have served as executive director of the Dalberg Group, which is the collection of businesses we've established around this goal of a more inclusive and sustainable world. Interestingly, of course, we do have a substantial presence in India and across Asia today, offices in Mumbai and Delhi, as well as elsewhere in Asia. That was the work I did. And in addition to kind of playing a set of administrative and organizing functions within Dalberg, I also continued to be a consultant But my focus was really on questions of youth employment and livelihoods. My sense being, as someone working on issues in Africa, climate change was an important challenge, but was really an issue that had been created in largely the global north and needed to be dealt with there. It was a dangerous distraction from the task of addressing extreme poverty in my part of the world. And that was my view until about maybe 3.5 or 3 years ago, when I had to acknowledge that looking across the work we were doing on job creation, youth skills, market creation, investment flows, and so on, that Africa was not yet on a trajectory to create enough jobs to absorb its big demographic boom. Actually, the reasons for that were fairly structural. No amount of smart policy making or innovative investing was going to really address some of the structural limits on Africa's current rate of job creation and growth, which really proceeded from the fact that Africa is stuck in a primary producer, raw material exporter stage of almost every value chain it participates in. And that means that no matter what you do, if you're a high population raw material exporting country, it doesn't matter how hard you work, you're always going to be importing back products with a greater amount of value added than the raw materials you're exporting. And that means you really aren't generating the surpluses you need. Even if you get more efficient in your extraction of raw materials, it's just hard to get into really, diversified economies, sustainable middle income status, and so on. So the question I asked myself and I asked the team was, well, okay, if this is the reality, what would it take to shift it? And we concluded, well, you need a major shakeup of the global economy if you wanted to shift Africa's positioning, because that positioning wasn't determined in Africa, it was determined everywhere else. And that then brought me to focus on climate, and in two ways. The first was recognizing that climate change itself was wreaking havoc on global supply and value chains in ways that might argue for more onshoring, nearshoring, etc. in the future, and shifts in where it made sense to produce things. But the second thing was that, which was perhaps more exciting, was that everything we were reading about the existential necessity of net zero also highlighted that would require massive shifts in every sector of human activity, how we produce, how we consume, how we live, etc. And in those shifts, there was an opportunity. In those shifts that I call climate action writ large, there was an opportunity. And as we better understood that opportunity, I became convinced that the key to Africa's transition to middle income status actually lies in enthusiastically embracing climate action as an economic strategy. And so that's where we are now.
Awesome. I have a quick follow-up and then we can dive into this question. One of the things that, is sort of very challenging when you come from, say, a country like India or, countries in Africa is how do you reconcile between, showcasing solutions and being part of solutions and part of climate change, but also the fact that the pollution was caused by someone else and, the principles of common but differentiated responsibility. So how do you continue to work on solutions at a domestic level, but also argue for the core principle of common but differentiated responsibility? Yeah. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
So I think it's an important point, but I come at it a little bit differently, almost by definition from the things that my newcomers analysis suggested. So common but differentiated responsibility is just and moral, and it's a good starting point. However, we also know that human nature being what it is, the market for polluter actually making up for their harms is unlikely to clear. And so there's one aspect of this that's a pure pragmatic one that says, I really appreciate that there are people out there who will fight the good fight of saying, you all caused it, you need to play a bigger role in fixing it, and they should keep on doing that. I'm not sure that they will succeed. Or rather, I'm not sure that they will succeed fast enough for my children to enjoy a usable planet. And so separately, there's a question of what needs to be done and who can do what needs to be done. Secondly, though, and I think more importantly for me, that's kind of a first thing that just acknowledges that work is important. But I do think that work increasingly over the last few years rests on an increasingly flawed premise, which is that the shifts in economic approaches in the energy markets, in areas of production, etc., it is increasingly evident that the green way is the future way, or is more likely to be an economically beneficial way. I come from Kenya. Kenya spends the largest share of its limited foreign exchange earnings on fuel importation. right? We have some oil reserves. They're of modest quantity and tricky quality. And even if we were to become an oil exporter, it's very likely that we would still continue to import fuels. And yet we are bathed as a country in renewable energy resources, shifting towards, embracing both, massive development of our renewable energy resource, which we already do. Kenya's grid is already 92% renewable today, right? Just scaling that up, going with electrify everything. The minute people hear it, they say, oh, no, Africa isn't ready for electric cars. But I say, well, why not? We've got surplus electricity and a deficit of fossil fuels. Why wouldn't we go electric first? And again, you come up against these interesting paradoxes where you realize because Africa in particular doesn't have a huge vested interest in the fossil fuel economy of today, very little other than South Africa and parts of North Africa, very few African countries have domestic facing fossil fuel infrastructure of any value to speak of. Our calculus around transitioning is not a write off your existing asset base and invest in a new asset base calculation. It is build the right thing from the start. And that's a very different approach. And that potentially gives us an edge. Now, I recognize that in some ways puts us on an opposite side of the table from India, which is in the process of ramping up its investments in, industrialization, or what I call the 20th century model. But I do think even in India, you're starting to see the recognition that the case for a green transition is actually a business case, once you get past some of the stranded asset issues.
Great. Thanks for touching upon that topic, which primarily forms the core agenda of our discussion with you today. I'll just first start with the topical thing at hand, which is the upcoming COP27 happening in Egypt. And globally, experts are expecting that African countries will get a chance to put forward their agenda more than ever. So, before we delve into the nitty gritties, what do you expect would be the key themes that would emerge in this particular COP?
So I'll answer what I think will happen, which is very different from what I normatively think should happen. I think this COP will be heavily anchored in the dual questions of the global north, in particular, meeting its previous commitments around compensation for support for adaptation and resilience, and compensation for loss and damage suffered by particularly African nations as a result of climate change. This is further complicated by all of the shocks that are roiling global energy markets and indeed all global commodity markets because of the conflict in Ukraine and so on. So there's going to be a lot of, okay, how are you guys going to make us whole? How are you all going to make us whole for the damage we suffered? And I think a lot of countries have anchored in the narrative that says Africa is clearly the climate victim in this dialogue, having done the least in terms of both historical and current per capita emissions to cause the problem, and in many ways suffering the most on two dimensions. Arguably Africa suffers the most. One is just geographically, the tropics are seeing some of the starkest impacts, and we have a lot of tropical real estate in Africa. But I think secondly, climate change is a crime of the old against the young, and we are the youngest continent. All of that, as I said before, is correct. And the moral case behind it is largely unassailable. But I think it obscures a more important reality, which is that because the continent has large untapped reserves of renewable energy, is a net exporter of many crucial raw materials, and has large expanses of currently underused or unproductive land, unproductive in the sense of it's either, degraded or something. And finally has, a pretty substantial young and growing workforce. Actually, the real conversation we should be having is what are the investment cases for centering climate action around Africa? That is both around ensuring Africa stays green from the start and transitions directly to non-emitting kind of technologies. And that's not being done just to help Africa. It helps everyone if we avoid the extra 12 billion tons that Africa will be emitting by 2050 if it goes on a business as usual pathway. So if we can avoid those 12, the easiest way to shut down those 12 billion tons is never build them. But that doesn't mean Africa stays poor. It means that we are really making a concerted effort to provide the capital stock to enable a leapfrogging that is good for everyone into new technologies. The second area is to say these three elements, the labor force, the energy resources, and the raw materials and land, make Africa a very interesting new hub for manufacturing for the world. Essentially, you can decarbonize global production by having Africa play a bigger role in it. Perhaps the most obvious space where that is true is in Africa's mineral exports, many of which are shipped without even the most basic of processing. And that means we're basically shipping chunks of Guinean mountain to Australia where coal is burnt to turn it into steel. Even if you kept the exact same metallurgical process, if you just did it in the country where this is being produced, there's a huge carbon benefit from the avoided shipping. Not to mention, what if you are able to use a more renewable tilted energy mix for the processing? So that's the most obvious example, but there's a range of others, everything from, what role Africa can play in green hydrogen and its various dependent industries and light manufacturing and so on and so forth. And the last area where Africa's potential is under-recognized, but you're starting to hear some African leaders, and you will hear some conversation about this at COP, is in its role in the great task of carbon removal and climate restoration, because we are going to need a substantial amount. I think the current estimate is between, at least 200 billion tons of carbon removal will be needed between now and 2050. Now, that requires Africa's existing carbon sinks, natural ones, to be maintained and indeed even expanded. Projects like the Great Green Wall, the AFR 100, and other initiatives like that to really expand the remaining protected landscapes of Africa. It also means leveraging other land under cultivation and creating mechanisms to reward farmers and others for monitoring, managing soil carbon and so on and so forth. But finally, it might also mean turning some of our renewable energy and our large basalt reserves and so on and so forth into the ideal home for some parts of the engineered removal ecosystem. So durable carbon removal through technologies such as direct air capture, which people always raise their eyebrow and say, why would you do that in Africa? I'm saying, well, where else could you do it without horrendous trade-offs?
Just taking forward on the point that you said, that what should happen and what could happen, on the point of what could happen, is there's this apprehension and fear among several stakeholders that this COP could be a washout because the West or the global North would fail to commit any more funding. The same old harping about $100 billion, nothing for loss and damage funding, nothing on the polluter pays principle. And that could, put all the plans that the African nations or the global South puts forward in a perilous position. From that angle, how do you think it would pan out, this discussion over the moolah?
I think that in the current economic climate, I will be pleasantly surprised if there are major new financial commitments of the scale that is expected by the global South and particularly by Africa from the global North. And I think that that is likely to lead to some heated discussion. Again, I completely understand where those who'd find that upsetting are coming from. But I also do think that there is an opportunity here to look beyond the areas that are about just pure transfers, which are justified. And again, I keep on saying that because I don't want anyone to say I'm saying that these are not real obligations that those who benefit from causing climate change owe the rest of us. But at the same time, there are also currently viable and attractive investment opportunities that are good for the planet, good for the continent, and good for the deployers of capital. And we need to do a better job of articulating those and highlighting the ways in which technological advances in the last decade, new business models, and new policies can all come together to create huge new opportunities that aren't currently being tapped. So, for example, there are literally hundreds of millions of tons of quote unquote carbon credits from protection and restoration available for African countries to develop and bring to market today with no changes in existing rules and regulations and the expectation of an increasingly deepening market. Realizing that this is a new resource, that this stewardship of carbon is a new resource or economic activity that they can deploy some of their workforces to, and orienting themselves towards optimizing that is one way in which you can actually walk away from conversations like COP with a new secured quote unquote export market for something that's also good for your local environment. Similarly, it cannot be overstated just how attractive parts of the African continent are for renewable energy investment, especially if paired with new productive use industries, and making that case in a way that says, here is the world, if you've got a certain fixed number of solar panels that you've purchased and you want to translate them into a yield of energy for productive use, this is the best place to put them. and here's the space, here's the workforce, and here are the raw materials. I think we need to think in that direction to capture some of that low-hanging fruit, not letting go of some of the harder zero-sum negotiations, but also recognizing that they're not the only spaces for climate action. And there's a lot of areas that are non-zero sum and indeed positive sum opportunities that we're not pursuing as aggressively as we could be.
Great. I mean, I'm really loving this conversation. I have many questions, but let me start by asking one question, and perhaps I just want to see your reaction to this. Although you have emphasized many, many times that, this is morally very important, but do you think that the economy of developing countries asking climate finance and then global north, providing some carrot, but not the full carrot, this economy of these negotiations benefits both, and that prevents developing or emerging economies from actually asking for things that you just highlighted, showcasing solutions? So is this conversation taken over like the real sort of issues, and how do you actually convince leaders in Africa to go beyond the rhetoric? Because I completely agree with you that these countries have solutions to showcase, have things that are more solution oriented, future looking, it's part of the 21st century. But at the same time, the old economy of asking climate finance and global north not give, how do you reconcile, how do you make James's voice stronger in Africa compared to others who want to argue for this?
I don't know that it's my voice personally. I think that there's a category of actors, but I think it's just simple mathematics, right? In their wildest dreams, folks who are arguing the victim side of this toss are saying, we need 100 billion. You actually should give us $1 trillion, but there's no way you're going to produce $1 trillion a year to help us with what we need. And so we'll take 100 billion because that's what you promised, and you're not even going to do that unless you net it out of other development aid and so on and so forth. And everyone knows this. At the same time, whatever you may think of it, there's $130 trillion of assets under management by the members of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And while it's coming under pressure and it still needs to find its legs, it does mean that there are hundreds of trillions of dollars of assets today out there that have in one way or another committed to optimizing their global carbon footprint. That means shifts. So in that world and at that scale, quibbling over 100 billion here or there is literally picking the pennies off the floor with your begging bowl while the main feast is happening in a different corner altogether. And you can see it. The big discussions about the mega investments that the planet will need do not involve Africa at all. Even though when you actually dig into what it will take to do many of the things we need to do, it's really hard to see how the global climate accounts balance without having Africa very heavily involved. Right now, we're trying to debate between the OECD countries, which might, with some squeezing, but are probably on a track to get to net zero somewhere around 2050. The next wave, the BRICS and peer countries, who really best case are looking at 2060, 2070, even 2080 for net zero. And we're trying to say, well, but the whole planet needs to get to net zero by 2050, according to the scientific information in our hands. Now, either you end up with this really difficult conversation between those two parties that says you all need to destroy your economies to get to net zero, or you all need to compensate us for going to net zero, or you bring in a third party who's very close to net zero and say that the number line still works the way I was taught in primary school and secondary school. And if some people are going to be net positive, well, guess what? We need to create a market for someone to go massively net negative. Right? It's actually the most efficient solution for all of the parties around the table, but we are leaving by limiting the conversation to the big emitters of today. And by Africa embracing a victim positioning for itself, it leaves itself off of the big table where the real major decisions will be taken, even as we recognize that demographically and via projected economic growth, Africa definitely belongs on that big table by 2050. And faster if it conceives this climate advocacy or climate action kind of role or agency. So my point is, look at the numbers. This is not about sentiment. This is not about, well, no, we should do this, because the numbers tell you that the economically rational thing to do is try and position yourself to be climate competitive if you're a country that isn't competitive in today's kind of fossil fuel dominated space. You have the least to lose from pivoting to the new. And if you do that aggressively enough, you then move from asking for grants and aid and donations and start arguing for investment, which is a positive feedback loop in the fullness of time.
I have a really quick follow-up. I'm just fascinated by this topic. So my follow-up is like, I understand the rationale, I understand the logic of your statements, but how do you actually convince your leaders? Do you think you're in minority? You meaning like the people who think like you?
For now, yes, but actually it's proven relatively not easy, but it is happening faster than I expected. One should not underestimate the degree to which African policymakers understand the catch-22 that they currently are in. They are trying to mobilize capital to develop their economies and so on. If you can speak to them in the language that they care about, and that's what CAPA, the Climate Action Platform for Africa, which is the organization I started to help pursue this argument. If you can come, as CAPA does, with arguments that are framed in 3 languages, you need to be trilingual in this space. You need to speak the language of carbon. These are the emissions or avoided emissions or other environmental impacts of a particular action. This is how many megatons are avoided if we do this per annum, or if we don't do that per annum. You then need to speak the language of international capital, which is here's the potential IRRs from doing this, right? It'll cost this much, it'll return this much, either from carbon markets or avoided expense or other planned expenditures. So you need to speak it in dollars. What's the money involved? And thirdly, you need to speak in the language of policymakers and politicians around the world, which is the language of jobs. This is how many jobs, where they would be, what form they would take. If you speak to a politician in the language of carbon, they will say, the environment minister is over there in the corner. Usually I don't listen to them very much, but tell them that story and they'll go see if they can turn that into cash and aid via some donors. Well, if you come to them with a pure money discussion, in some countries, if your governance isn't too strong, you may end up with an outcome you weren't looking for. But if you come to them with, hey, here is how many jobs we can create from really reorienting the economy around managing our soils and our ecosystems, or rather, here's our competitiveness argument for saying if you shift or you build more manufacturing here, we are competitive from a carbon density perspective, and we can actually be an advantageous location for new investment. And then you can't bring that, for goodness sake, to the climate advocacy community. You need to tell them, I am doing all of this because it's worth this many tons. This industrial park needs to be built. You need to let it be built, because if you do build this industrial park, which is powered by 92% renewable energy, yes, you lose 1,000 hectares of land here, but you reduce global emissions by this amount and you spare other land and allow other spaces to recover and recuperate. And that trilingual approach is non-negotiable if you're trying to orchestrate this shift. But when you can do that, what I've found is everyone understands the criteria they're optimizing for, and you can show them convincingly that what you're proposing will speak to their metrics. They're willing to be open to it. And, as we're seeing, if you read the IEA reports and so many other analysis, the wind is increasingly at the backs of those arguing for a faster energy transition. Pun very much intended. And now you just need to lean into it. And that's one area. Of course, there's other areas like construction, manufacturing, and so on. But in each of these areas, the options are increasing, the barriers are reducing, and the benefits to adoption are increasing. So you just need to make the case.
Great. That was an amazing explanation. And I'll move on to a different issue. The 2 continents are obviously unique when it comes to their issues. But in terms of, say, climate impact or climate action, there are a lot of problems and also solutions that could be a common ground between South Asian and African nations. Do you think there could be a kind of collaboration between the two to push for a favorable agenda, especially with regards to climate action or climate impact that these continents are facing from, say, historic polluters, or pushing for an agenda that favors the 2 continents in terms of better financing, better access to technologies, etc.?
I think so, but I also think that the answer is granular. There's already substantial areas of collaboration. So, for example, East Africa's fastest growing clean cooking solution is driven by a clean cooking company that's shifting to ethanol-based cooking. Their cook stoves are designed and manufactured in Ahmedabad, shipped here to Kenya, where they are matched with locally assembled ATMs that issue the ethanol. The ethanol is imported from Brazil. And so you can see how these pieces come together to aid forest protection, because the largest driver of deforestation in my part of the world is deforestation for the purposes of wood fuel for cooking. And so there's opportunities like that that are about the manufacturing base, the technological base, and so on aligning. I think there's also very clearly an ongoing battle to be fought around recognizing those moral obligations that I talked about earlier, because those countries in the tropics are the ones really feeling the early brunt of climate change. I think when we get to some of the subsequent questions, all sides kind of keeping an eye on the really long term. Because, for example, once you start talking about what's needed to really curtail emissions, the reality is, we need to go after carbon intensity in the world, right? And for better or worse, our richer OECD countries were very successful in moving most of their emissions heavy industry out of their borders. They kept the consumption, but they've shifted the production into other countries that are now fast growing economies. And so when we talk about, for example, putting a greater pressure on decarbonizing, a lot of that then ends up being a conversation amongst ourselves in the developing world, between those who are already heavily invested in industrial bases and those who haven't yet. And that's where I think then rethinking the role, being in the tropics together has some challenges it creates, but it also creates some shared opportunities. India is now the fastest deployer of solar in the world, and the impact that's having on the cost of PV deployment is fantastic and will allow Africa to be as fast, if not faster. And so I think there's areas of collaboration like those. But I think the area where I think we end up in different stages of bearing the brunt of choices made in previous centuries is that question of how do we think about emissions today? Because if you left it to me, I would say, well, we need to tax carbon at the highest price possible everywhere in the world. But that's easy for me to say. I've got a 92% renewable grid. That's great. It's harder, even though India has the resources to go more and more renewable. It's a harder trade-off because you're already on a trajectory. And that's where I think with every country, there's always going to be areas of alignment, and understanding those aligned interests are important. But so is understanding where the interests may not be identical, but can still be complementary.
But can there be any sort of, say, a self-reliance between these countries? Because going forward, it looks like depending on finance or technology on the Western world is increasingly becoming different. I'll use the word excuse. There is an excuse every year. And there's obviously a lot of developmental experts which are of the view that these countries should now look inwards, given the kind of growth their economies are doing and the resource richness that the African nations have. Do you think a self-reliant network sort of collaboration that might be mulled upon between these two continents specifically?
100%. I think no part of the world has been developed through the benevolence of another part of the world. That's just a reality, right? You move up in the global economic rankings, often at the expense of others, and that's usually a contested fight that becomes more contested the further up you move, if we're just honest with ourselves. I think that there are already, right, we've seen most African economies already reorienting to the East in terms of where our raw materials are shipped and so on and so forth, and the trading relationship. So that's already the case. I think it's tricky when you take climate into account, because part of what you need to do, and when you take long-term economic trade, because what's happening essentially is Asian economies are moving higher and higher up the value addition. And yet, the relationship with African economies increasingly needs to be one that involves greater and greater value addition sitting in Africa, both from a planetary perspective, to the point I made earlier, and to the perspective of saying our workforce is still growing, whereas Asia is beginning to stabilize and will begin to very, very gradually shrink in size over time. And so that's why it becomes tricky. If I'm very honest, that's why it becomes tricky, because I'm saying the next marginal large factory, which India quite justifiably says should be in Gujarat to create more jobs because you're still on your way up. I'm saying, well, I can power it greener and I have even more unemployed people in Mombasa. And that requires some nuanced collaboration. And the reason I'm focusing on that is too often it's very easy to say, rah, rah, let's partner together and shake off the yoke of the colonizer. But we do need to recognize that that requires really understanding each other's interests and figuring out where the trade-offs exist. which are sometimes easier with an economy that's very different from yours. I don't know that there's that many aspiring steel workers in certain parts of Europe, but there are in India. And so if I say I want to build a big steel industry in Africa, there needs to be a discussion about, well, if I'm attracting Indian capital to do it, will we end up with the same kinds of protests in India that we saw in the US about offshoring of jobs there? So yeah, that's a complexity I struggle with, while at the same time recognizing that that complexity is one corner of the picture. There's the majority of the picture where there's obvious both lessons to be learned, technologies to be leveraged, better cost structures. I no longer believe that the best and most appropriate technologies for the 21st century will come from quote unquote the global north, just because a lot more of the practical innovation is happening in the places where these machines are being made today. That's how technological innovation works. It's not ivory tower innovation, it's from manufacturing and making. And so there, I think there's huge opportunity. And the question is how to accelerate what's already happened.
That's super fascinating. I hear your inspirational business case when it comes to climate action, to do the manufacturing of 21st century, to generate the power needed to run the 21st century, from solar and wind. I completely, I'm on the same page in terms of solutions are important. Africa has potential. It should negotiate in that way. How does one change its position when it comes to currently facing impacts? Like, how do you create loss and damage that's happening today into bankable projects to attract investments? Or how do you, when you have to adapt, say Kenya or Tanzania or any country, when you have to adapt to future, how do you invite capital markets to invest in that? Somebody has to fund the adaptation and loss and damage. Mitigation, I can completely understand, but do you have any thoughts on how do you mobilize resources to adapt and also compensate for loss and damage?
I think the reality is most funding for adaptation, resilience, loss, and damage will have to come from nations themselves, is the sad reality. And that means the worst thing a country can do in the face of the impending climate crisis that will bring lots of loss and damage and demand lots of adaptation and resilience. The absolute worst thing a country can do is stay poor. And that's where you then create the impetus, is to say, where are the spaces where you can be a competitive destination for investment? And let's remember that no country that's undertaken this journey has done so from a past of ease and wealth and plenty, right? You usually begin, now it's more than, it's a couple of centuries back, but, Dublin, the Celtic Tiger, Ireland, home of famine and distress. America's current industrial dominance, seeds were laid in the Great Depression amidst an environmental crisis at the time, the Dust Bowl, as well as huge conflict globally. And I think we need to, as decision makers or those adjacent to decision makers in the countries of, for lack of a better word, we call the global south, we need to recognize that, yes, accept help where it is available, but the help is the little cherry on top of the cake. And I'm not one of those who says aid is a terrible thing, we should do without it. I think it can be helpful, but it cannot take the place of thoughtful decision making about how you use the resources that you do have to improve your station. And so to your point, if someone came to Kenya today, I could totally spend a lot of time going to the drought-stricken zones and saying, here's all the people who need help. And if there was someone looking to give help in that way, I should do that. But I should also not forget while I'm there, oh, by the way, there is Lake Turkana Wind, our wind farm in the north of Kenya. The second in all of the world, the second most productive wind farm in the world in terms of capacity factors. And it's only using 10% of its potential today. That's free energy, right next to one of the world's best geothermal baseload producing reservoirs in Lake Turkana. Oh, and by the way, it's really hot here. Don't you agree? It's really, really sunny. And there's lots of empty, barren, rocky land. That's free solar energy. Making that case and then saying, well, what is that for? Is that for, a hydrogen value chain? Is that for smelting of some mineral? Is that for processing the lithium that might exist in some of the Rift Valley lakes? That's the job that no one's going to do for us unless we do it ourselves. And that's the job that I think too often in thinking about climate, by casting ourselves purely as victims, we forget to say, well, the world's largest workforce of the future needs to also take on the world's biggest challenge. And that's going to be climate. And we need to raise our hand and say, this is how we're going to do it. And if investment comes, great. But even if it doesn't come, we weren't doing it because of the investors. We were doing it because we're the ones with the biggest stake in the future.
Okay. So let's shift back to COP and just talk about if you are hearing like a strategy between the African Union and different countries as they go to COP. I know you mentioned in the beginning that it seems that the narrative is going to be a lot about loss and damage and climate finance, but do you see anything beyond that countries are developing to go and negotiate at this COP?
I think one of the things I'm most interested in is growing attention among several African countries around the power of carbon markets, both voluntary and compliance, and with Article 6 and all the provisions therein. And I think it's the beginning of the right kind of discussion, because a carbon market discussion is no longer about how will you pay me for what you did to me. It is much more about here is an asset that I am maintaining, protecting, or expanding for the planet. Let's get a fair price for it. And importantly, let's make sure that we use the private voluntary markets and the more regulated and still emerging very early stage compliance markets in ways that feed into each other in the right way. And that we have policies that basically say, well, if Salesforce wants to provide the capital that allows us to protect large swaths of Tanzanian savanna, well, that is a transaction that should be encouraged, not discouraged by the rules. And that is a separate transaction from assessing Tanzania's carbon footprint versus the United States, because Salesforce is not America. Salesforce is a multinational company, and it should be able to spend in pursuit of its net zero goals wherever it chooses to, independent of then looking at the relevant individual carbon footprints of the countries where it is spending. So I think things like that become really relevant. Things like ensuring that the carbon markets are just in other ways, such as right now, the structure of those markets and the nature of who does the brokerage, the MRV, all of that work means that cents on the dollar actually make it to the communities that are doing the work of protecting ecosystems very, very often. And we need to shift that so that it's a much more efficient space with not with 100 middle intermediaries. And secondly, that there are real expectations of how much of the value flows through, because unless you're getting that flow through, you're not driving an incentive. I eventually want to get to a place where the carbon prices are getting high enough and the transmission mechanisms are clear enough that a young kid in the village can rock up on a new electric bike. Someone will ask, how did you afford that? Well, I've been doing this thing with carbon. I'll show you how. That's how you get mass adoption. That's how you drive a rapid transition, is you trigger entrepreneurial opportunities for folks that are aligned with our climate objectives. I'm seeing that conversation about carbon markets picking up momentum, and that's exciting. I think there's a different set of questions that I don't know if they'll feature at COP, but African countries are increasingly aware of the global scramble for future green hydrogen production. And you see a number of countries announce new projects and commitments and so on and so forth. I think what you'll see in this COP, as you saw in the last COP, is more African decision makers saying, wait, tell me more about hydrogen. But that's really a gateway to a larger conversation about tell me more about what I can do with my renewable energy resource. And to me, if that curiosity carries on and maybe comes to more fruition by Dubai in terms of new positions and so on, that will also be a win. So the short answer is I'm optimistic that we're starting to see more rigor and thoughtfulness around the future of carbon markets. And I also think that you'll see greater awareness of this new green economy and the opportunities it opens up among leaders during COP, not because necessarily of the sessions, but because of some of the side chats, the industry groups presenting, and so on and so forth. Oh, one other thing. I do think that pressing the likes of GFANs, pressing the financial institutions to move beyond their current framing, which is really an exclusionary framing, will zero out our portfolios. And the way we do it is we'll say, we are not funding these types of projects, mostly in the global south. We'll still do them in Germany, but we won't do them in India or Kenya. That's fine. It's not what I would do, and it's really unfair. What we're not hearing from them that would actually be helpful is here are the sectors that we will actually lean into and will actually work to lower the cost of capital or direct capital into, because we see the positive synergy with our climate goals. And that then can become a very positive signal that says, if I can develop opportunities that meet the following parameters, that can attract the capital I need to develop my country.
On a concluding note, I just wanted to ask, during last year's COP, net zero was the buzzword. And as it had turned out, it is just a buzzword. What do you think would be the key buzzwords or takeaways from this COP? How will this COP set the trend for what all changes, say, in the green energy, climate financing, and carbon markets also that you mentioned?
So two things. I think that net zero ended up being overtraded in the short term. But like many things that are overtraded in the short term, like the internet in the late 90s and the early 2000s, I don't think that it's a term or a concept completely without merit. I do think that if we really think through what we want to happen, net zero creates a framework in which resources can flow from polluters who cannot cut down their polluting fast enough to places that can actually both offset and make up for that in a range of ways. And I think that aspect and making sure that works is the work of years, not one meeting. And that's fine. Like that's to be expected when a new thing comes out and is not fully understood. But I think it's a journey. I think similarly, new slogans that I'd expect to come out of maybe not this COP, but one can hope. I do think some framing, I'm not great at coming up with slogans or terms, but economically viable climate action, right? We need to start moving from the narrative that says saving the climate is purely about avoiding bad acts. So it's about kind of, like penitent pilgrims, we must now fast and constrict ourselves, which we should do. We do need to go on a diet. That's true. But in addition, there's a space of this that is just a set of clearly understood technical challenges. And there are challenges in the worlds of science, engineering, finance, and policy. And they need to be tackled the same way that you tackle the challenge of making a faster microprocessor every 2 years. And if we can get into those loops that say, yes, there's a political process, but we now have a direction of travel. We now have some underlying trends, some macro trends that are no longer deniable in terms of the rate of reduction of price of units of renewable energy, storage, and so on and so forth. Those things are now clear. Now it falls to people who want to be climate activists to decide, do I want to be the one who's out in the street protesting? Do I want to be the one that's engineering a new solution? Do I want to be the one that's investing in new solutions? Do I want to be the one regulating a new solution? And that's a very different stage of the journey from, I equate it in the histories of our post-colonial countries to the difference between the people who actually were out there kind of protesting and fighting to end colonialism, and then those who had to be like, oh, now we have to run a government. So now we need to pick up these tools and we actually need to build a green economy. And I think in that, my hope is something like that. An economically viable climate action is something that's increasingly clear because we need to create jobs while fixing the planet. There's just no way around that. And we need to possibly do it with very little help from the people who got rich messing it up.
Thank you so much. This has been a remarkable conversation. I learned a lot. Just understanding, the different models of how we think about climate action in the African context. We have similar kind of situation in India where, some people want to talk much more about common but differentiated responsibility, but others also think about it in terms of business case. So I really appreciated, all your feedback, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you all. Love the work that you're doing and looking forward to hearing it.
Thank you for listening to the India Energy Hour. Subscribe to this channel to never miss an update. To drop us a feedback, visit our website or write to us at theindiaenergyhour@gmail.com. We are on Twitter. You can follow at TIEH_podcast and get in touch with the two hosts at Shreya_Jay and at Sandeep Pai with double I.